Well, with me now is Hannah White, Deputy Director at the Institute for Government. I mean, in terms of the mechanics then, if Boris Johnson gets to October the 19th, no deal and no letter, he refuses to ask for a delay, what can MPs do in Parliament?
He'll be breaking the law at that point. I think two things will happen. There will very likely be court cases brought against him, and at the same time, I imagine that parliamentarians will bring a vote of no confidence against him.
Right, but after a vote of no confidence, there's normally 2 weeks in which you look for an alternative Prime Minister. That would take us over the no-deal line.
So there's a 2-week window, but it doesn't need to take 2 weeks. So that after 2 weeks, you would automatically have an election. But the point of it is to allow an opportunity for somebody else to try to command the confidence of the House. And I think in a situation like this, where Boris Johnson was breaking the law, other people who didn't like that would get together and find somebody else who they did have confidence in, who could command the confidence of the House.
Doesn't that still require Boris Johnson to go to the Queen and say, I can't be Prime Minister anymore, and you need to appoint whoever it is who's commanded the confidence of the House? What if he just doesn't?
I think in a situation like this, and, you know, it's completely unthinkable, really, but the Queen has...
he might be in a court or in a police cell by then.
Indeed. And, you know, in those circumstances, I think, you know, it would be open to the Queen to sack him and to put someone else in who she felt could command the confidence of the House. I think if you have a Prime Minister who is openly breaking the law, she could do that.
So it comes down to the Queen?
It comes down to the Queen.
That is an extraordinary truth, isn't it?
That is why this is deeply undesirable, because it is always the case in our Constitution that the Queen should be kept out of politics and that a Prime Minister should only resign if he can recommend somebody else who could be Prime Minister in their place.
And in terms of the election, because, I mean, presumably Boris Johnson is doing this partly because he's hoping people will go on Monday, oh, look, let's just have an election. That's the safest way of changing things. I mean, how much leeway is there around the timing of an election? You know, could they agree to call an election on Monday but time it for after November, or you know, can they lengthen or shorten that 5-week period?
So you could legislate to change the 25-day period you have to have, but the problem is that whoever is the incumbent Prime Minister gets to set the date of the election, and even if you had legislated to set the date of the election, my sense is that people who oppose the possibility of no deal don't entirely trust that Boris Johnson wouldn't find a way around that and say, well, actually, you know, that's the law, but now I'm going to use my prerogative to try to change the date again. Given
this law has basically taken control from the government, is there nothing that MPs can do to take away the prerogative of the Prime Minister to be the person who asks for that delay? Parliament can't decide that it's going to ask for the delay as the government, can it?
No, so our foreign policy is a prerogative of the Prime Minister. It would be up to the Prime Minister to have to ask for an extension to conduct foreign policy on behalf of the country. What Parliament would have to do is change the Prime Minister rather than change the law in this circumstance, I think.
Right. So, I mean, what do you think is the most likely course then?
That is the question. I think this week we're going to see... I think the opposition vote against the opportunity for an election. I think probably then the House will be prorogued, suspended. I think it's not in the Prime Minister's interest to keep Parliament around when he could, you know, be out, either negotiating with the EU, hoping to get a deal that he can put to Parliament before the 19th of October, which is the key date in this bill, or failing that, essentially starting to campaign before the election kicks off, hoping that when he gets towards the end of October, this bluff will mean that he can say, well, actually, you know, this was completely against my will, but I'm going to have to send this letter.
And I suppose one other consequence of this is that all this period of actual sort of shadow campaigning doesn't fall within any of the election rules.
Exactly.
So people can spend what they want, there are no limits, the money can come from wherever it comes.
Well, and that's why this is something you were mentioning before, that I think Lord Heseltine was mentioning, you know, the police are sort of uncomfortable about some of what the Prime Minister has been doing. There have been some questions asked about, you know, is this campaigning or is this normal activity on the part of the Prime Minister? But many people have said that they feel that it's, you know, we shouldn't be campaigning yet because there isn't an election to campaign for.
So there are restrictions, but we'll see exactly what comes out in the wash as to when this comes out.
It's always the case when people can see an election happening soon that activity starts to bear more of a relation to a campaign.
Hannah White, thank you very much.